and see my baby before I leave this world. We were out on a date in my... Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. Today I'm continuing the Fall of Stefan Molyneux series, and that means, of course, that I have with me my trusty co-host, Wes Bertrand. Wes, say hi to everyone.
Hey, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Thanks, Chris. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And we have a special guest with us today, Kevin McKernan. Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. So I do a lot of work in genomic sequencing, and I'm naturally taking an interest in this R versus K selection. I'll call it a hypothesis. I don't think it actually qualifies as a theory yet, but we'll get into that. But my background was I worked on the Human Genome Project from 96 to 2000, managing the research and development group there at MIT, and I have started now 3 to 4 different biotech companies in the genomic space. And so I know a little bit about evolutionary theory, but arguably I'm a late comer to it, having only started in the space in 96.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yes, and of course, you mentioned R versus K. That's going to be the primary focus of our talk today. Of course, the subject of our topic today, Stefan Molyneux, is a big proponent of R versus K. So I guess I will attempt to give a quick description of what, in layman's terms, of what R versus K is. So R versus K, it's a reproductive strategy that's found in the animal kingdom that has been recognized, where R is more about, it thrives in situations where resources are abundant. K thrives in situations where resources are scarce. So the commonly used example would be R is like rabbits. There's virtually limitless grass on the planet, so that's pretty much all they need to live. So for them, their reproductive strategy is just have as many babies as possible, because you don't worry about the population overeating the grass because there's just so much grass. And they don't tend to have a lot of effort spent on rearing children. You know, you wouldn't pour a lot of effort into one child. You just have as many as possible. And, if a few get eaten by wolves, so be it. By predators, it's not a big deal. You just just keep spraying them out. And that seems to work well as far as an evolutionary strategy for reproduction. K's, this is where resources are scarce. You don't want to have a whole bunch of children because there's just not enough resources for that to happen. So what you do is you go for high quality children. The common example given is wolves, and they put a lot of energy into rearing a cub, rearing a pup, I guess it would be called for a wolf, and they want that pup to be as successful and as stout as possible, as opposed to just having as many as you can and not really worrying about the quality. So it's kind of a quality over quantity thing, and where this ties into Free Domain Radio is there was a book that came out by a gentleman by the name of Anonymous Conservative. And I'm trying to think, do you have the name of the book handily available, Wes?
Yeah, the book's title is, actually it's truncated on the EPUB version. Let me actually open the book.
Make it
it's
all
the evolutionary psychology behind politics, how conservatism and liberatism evolved within humans.
Liberalism, right?
Liberalism, that's right. Did I say liberatism? Yeah, it's a little foggy there.
Right. So this gentleman, Anonymous Conservative, or a gentlewoman, we're not sure what the sex is of this person, wrote this book where it says basically liberals are R's and conservatives are K's, and builds the case for that. So that's where Stefan Molyneux stepped in, and he was really attracted to this, that it's actually a genetic thing, that they have a gene, they've identified a gene for, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, and that you're actually at war. So he did a 3-part series titled Gene Wars, where basically you're literally, at least at the genetic level, you are at war with the others. So if you're conservative, you're at war with liberals. Liberals, you're at war with conservatives. and your seed is fighting the battle. As you you're wanting to stamp them out, they're wanting to stamp you out, etc. And it's really at the genetic level a survival of whichever particular breed of human that you are, the R versus K. So I guess before we start digging into our objections to that theory in R versus K, did I accurately summarize it, and what are the major parts I'm missing, or anyone feel free to address that?
Well, I'll chime in here in that this is a theory that E.O. Wilson put together with MacArthur. It predates any capacity to actually read DNA, and I think it's a very important topic that we'll get into.
Yeah,
and it's a very interesting intellectual pursuit. In that, I'm very fascinated by thinking about how DNA moves through time and how good ideas move through time, and this is something that I think is very attractive to humans to try and fit this story to what they see. But what I think we have found since we can read DNA is we can't really find any evidence of this in DNA. And that's what's made me somewhat interested in Stefan and other people's approach on trying to superimpose this onto their worldview, because it has, I'd say since about 1980, since we've had the capacity to do polymerase chain reactions and read DNA, we've been struggling to actually turn this hypothesis into a theory. It seems to be a rare case if it's in fact found at all.
And when you say that, you're just referring to the part of just in the animal kingdom, right? You're not even referring to at the human level?
In the human level, it would be very, very difficult to even run the experiment. For ethics aside, there just haven't been enough generations in humans to really get to that level. The key thing to zero in on here is the term selection, and what selection means to a genomicist is that there is evidence of selective pressure in the DNA that would support this theory. That we can't find. Now, what we do look for to do this, and this dives really head into some pretty technical stuff on how we measure selection in DNA, but I'll throw it out there and see where it goes. In DNA, there are regions that are coding regions. We call these either exons or protein coding regions of the genome. They're the areas we understand the most today and have the most selective pressure that we can measure. Those regions of the genome, they're made with an alphabet of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G are in DNA, and this alphabet of 4 letters makes a triplet language, if you will. So every 3 letters of DNA inside of a gene code for a particular amino acid, part of a protein, one Lego of a protein, if you will. And this triplet code, Sidney Brenner discovered it. He got a Nobel Prize for it. It was amazing work that he did. There are certain triplets that dictate like the start of a sentence, like a capital letter. ATG is one that starts from methionine. It's the start of a gene. And then there are end of genes that are stop codons. Now, the interesting thing about this language is that it's a little bit degenerate, meaning that there's only 21 amino acids out there. But if you do the math on triplets of 4 letters, one letter or one position inside of a gene can code for 4 different letters. 2 of them can code for 16, and 3 of them can code for 64. And there's a triplet codon system in DNA that codes for 64 different possibilities of amino acids, but there aren't 64 different amino acids. So there's some degeneracy, which means a couple different codons all can code for the same amino acid. And what that allows one to do is to look throughout coding regions in DNA and say, okay, how many times do we get variants that don't change the code to a different amino acid, and how many times do we get ones that do? So if you're following me here, what this is a measurement of is how many times do you get a silent mutation, a mutation that doesn't really change the outcome in evolution, and how many times do you get one that does? And when you measure that, that's what people call measuring synonymous variants, which they don't change the amino acid, but they do change the DNA, or non-synonymous ones. And it's the ratio of those two in a given coding region that defines selection. You have to see that in order for you to know that there's been either positive or negative selection for something. Now, many people, Graves included, there's a gentleman, Dr. Graves, who's done a lot of work in Drosophila on this, that has shown that when you take this into fruit flies, and the reason we study fruit flies is you can replicate them very quickly. They have short lifespans. You can get lots of progeny. You don't get any ethical issues doing this. And you can't find R versus K selection. In fact, you find things that tend to argue against it, which has been quite a shock because, frankly, the E.O. Wilson R versus K thing was actually very mentally appealing. And I think the reason for this is another evolutionary thing that's probably just as valid, if not more, than R versus K selection, which is that the human mind has evolved to find patterns. If we fail to see the tiger in the woods, we don't propagate. If we falsely fail the tiger, to find the tiger in the woods, we might get a big adrenaline spike, but we don't die. There's an asymmetric difference there in energy expenditure and propagation of information, such that the human mind's evolved to find patterns, and it does so with a very high false positive rate. And this is where these types of type 1 errors come into, with religions being born from seeing patterns in the stars and seeing Orion's belt and believing it means something. And our mind does this. And I think this is what's happened in the R versus K story here, is that Stefan and others are trying to fit their worldview to a very simplistic model. And it doesn't actually fit with what we can measure today scientifically in DNA.
That reminds me of this image that was going around the web. Did you see the image of Jesus that they found on a dog's butt? It was hilarious.
Nice. Salvation.
Wow. I don't know where to go with that one.
What, that isn't the perfect segue into your next talking point?
It's the tail wagging the dog there? I don't know.
Did Wilson base his theorizing on this on mammals primarily, or was it any sort of species? Or class, I guess.
I'm not as well. I have to confess, I'm not as well versed in all of his writings, because the moment you get the capacity to actually read DNA, you stop hypothesizing about it. And I was born into an era where we could do that, and so a lot of the hypothecation about whether selection was going left or right, or for this or for that, was really pontification in the past, without the capacity to actually measure it. But now that we do. It's so many layers of onions that you see different complexity in genomics that it's very difficult to tie to something so simplistic as this. So there's microbiomes now that we know about. There are cross species, what we know is lateral gene transfer going on. So it's very difficult to apply something like this to something like humans, because what you're arguing for is that this selection has occurred at the genetic level. It's written into the DNA. And there are many cases where people or organisms will change their R versus K just in a single lifespan, and that kind of refutes the entire thing. I mean, the classic case that really refuted it was the Chinese population boom post-World War II. In under a generation, we had the largest expanse of population ever known to humans in China. And that happened within a generation. So how can that be a propagative effect, right? That's an adaptive effect. That's more Lamarckian than Darwin.
Yeah, we kind of joked about that earlier because Chris was talking about his evolution to these ideas about freedom and how they have changed over time. And this has been the case for all the freedom lovers out there. We go through this evolutionary process within our own minds, and it doesn't necessarily mean our genes are changing, right?
Right.
Yeah, and they talk about this in the book. Well, it talks about the misery index. So in the book, where if they take the misery index and they're mapping it to conservative versus liberal leanings in the economy, they'll look at the misery index, which I think is basically it's unemployment plus inflation or something like that. It's looking at things are going bad in the economy. The misery is really high from an economical standpoint in the economy right now. And whenever the misery index is high, and they do these polls to ask people, the responses come back very conservative. They would vote very conservatively. They take a conservative stance on issues. When the misery index is low, things are going well. They answer these polls very liberally, leaning more towards liberal politicians, towards liberal stances on issues and the like. And the misery index, this changes course over like months, or years. It's not generations. I mean, they'll say, look, when the misery index was really high, look how conservative people were. And then 10 years later, look, when the misery index was really low, look how liberal people are. And I'm like, are you listening to yourself? 10 years has passed. Mm-hmm. How could this possibly be a change in the genetics? And then Steph, he had on a guest to talk about R versus K, Bill Whittle.
Yeah.
Who, for all we know, might be the anonymous conservative. We don't know, but this was Steph's guest expert for R versus K, right? And he was talking about how the United States overnight became notably more K when 9/11 happened. He said, whenever there's a threat, that can cause you to switch to being a K. That certain threats, like the threatening your way of life, it's not like the threat like the hawk comes down and eats the rabbit. That threat, you can ignore that if you're an R. But like if, hey, the law of gravity is going to be taken off the books and we don't even know what the hell is going to happen after that. When everything's going to change, your whole way of life is going to change, up is down, wet is dry, etc. That's when you can become more K because you're like, holy shit. And so he said, for 9/11, people became decidedly more K. I'm like, overnight, their genes changed? Are you serious here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're moving the goalposts, aren't they?
Yeah.
There's a shifting of the argument about this.
Yes.
Because you can ground it in genetics with this, theorizing, but it's not based on the evidence, obviously, when we get down to the nitty-gritty aspects of DNA and genes and so forth. But to call it gene wars has an extra level of sort of inflammatory nature because conservatives have always been at war with liberals, right? And vice versa. I mean, this is the epic battle we see played out in politics all the time.
Yeah, it's stoking the fires of eugenics. It's heinous. To call it genetic is to say it can't change.
Yeah, it's like the Anonymous Conservative book started out with a bunch of incorrect or false or unchecked premises and assumptions, and then it reasons a whole lot from there. So it was really hard to actually go through that book. I got through about half of it, and I was like, I'm done, because there needs to be a lot of checking of these premises instead of the whole shifting of the discussion from the beliefs that can change. Obviously, humans can change their beliefs and adapt to new circumstances, unlike rabbits and wolves, right? I mean, this is the distinctive quality about the human species. We are extremely adaptable. We're all over the planet right now. We have all kinds of ways to live in very extreme climates, whereas other animals are just adapted to their particular environments. So, I'm really distressed when there's this shifting of the discussion back and forth and trying to rely on any sort of piece of evidence to prove or validate your position, which is the conservative position, which is what Steph has been promoting, even though he says he's voluntarist and a freedom sort of proponent based on the thousands of shows he did previously. So it's just these contradictions that keep on coming up over and over again.
It's a classic case of confirmation bias. And I confess I've not watched all 3 hours or more of the Gene Wars. Just trying to get through the first 20 minutes in any scientific endeavor like this. If you don't shoot the elephant in the abstract, you're wasting everyone's time. And
yes.
the elephant in his argument is that the vast majority of genetic sciences in the 21st century have shot down R versus K. That never comes up in the first 20 minutes of Gene Wars. So you'd think he'd want to start off addressing that okay, there's some controversy here. There's another field of thought. Perhaps look at Graves' work. Perhaps look at others' work here. But that just went unannounced. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's data fitting.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because I know that Facebook comments is the place where reason goes to die. But. Reading Facebook comments or not Facebook, but YouTube comments rather. Reading the YouTube comments for our shows and some of the feedback I've gotten. I've had people be like, "Yeah, you need to look at study R versus K. That'll change your opinion." They're like, look up R versus K, and then come back to me. And I'm like, did you do that? Or did you just get it from Steph? Or did you just read Anonymous Conservative? Because if you looked up R versus K at all, you'd see this is like pseudoscience. This is Nobody believes this anymore. Nobody who has any kind of scientific chops follows this anymore.
I mean, it might be proven in some discrete ecosystems in the future, but I think it's unlikely to be a general theory just due to the complexity of genetics, the complexity of the environment. Everyone's genomes are adapting and selecting for different environments. And to try to put it through a lens like this, I think it plagues of some central planning. It plagues of people trying to superimpose some type of preferred outcome for the entire world. And that doesn't exist. There's just so many dynamic environments that genomes evolve to perform different functions in different places, that to think that it's just resource constraint K versus, rapid production R, or rate of production R, is so incredibly black and white that it tries to distill all of the genetic complexity that's going on in the world into A versus B, and there's just, if it's happening in a very, very discrete manner, and it probably won't be happening for very long.
Yeah, how do you think it applies to the main example that they use, wolves versus rabbits? I guess in America it would be coyotes versus rabbits, because coyotes typically eat a lot of rabbits.
So from a meta level, let's back up and say the wolf's health. Is it just about propagating the wolf's genome? Or what about the fact that the wolf likely has more genes on its body that are microbiological than there are its own? This never comes up in these types of R versus K discussions. So if you look at the even like humans and other mammals, we may have 20,000 genes in our genome. We arguably have 10 times the number of cells on our body that are microbial than our own, and those cells happen to have very compact gene-dense genomes. So we have 100 times the number of genes that are microbial than our own. What's the selection going on there? What message is getting propagated? Is our genome just a robot and a slave to move those around? Mm-hmm. This gets very complicated to try to claim that rabbits versus wolves, and it's that simple. And then you can look at what do they eat. Okay, so the genomes the rabbits are eating are probably plants. I'll take a plant that I've spent a lot of time studying is cannabis. Here's a plant that there are tenfold more cannabis plants sprouting every year than humans. And it's developed a repertoire of chemicals that has made humans propagate it. There's no doubt about that. The propagation of cannabis is spread out of the Himalayas primarily due to human contact. So who's the gardener? Are we gardening it? Is it gardening us? Because it's spreading its genes tenfold faster than we're spreading ours. Mm-hmm. And it begs the question of this type of information propagation. Is it just as simple as, okay, you're conservative and you're liberal? I think that's an incredibly opaque distillation of what's actually going on. Yeah. So I can't answer that. Like, what are the rabbits eating, and what are they propagating, and what seeds do they then defecate all over the place? Because there's probably something going on with what they eat and how they spread that. Likewise the birds. Yeah. It's to simplify it this way, I think, is a fallacy of comfort.
Yeah, and you kind of have to take your scientific thinking cap off and go in the realm of sort of an ideology that's trying to find what you're looking for, or looking for what you want to find, which again is the confirmation bias that we see. Another thing that I usually see in Steph's shows is reasoning by false analogy, and this is the example par excellence of that, I would guess.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you get a good analogy, then you win the argument.
By the way, Kevin, Scientific American published an article recently titled "Scientists Bust Myth That Our Bodies Have More Bacteria Than Human Cells," which was interesting. It says the number is roughly equal, scientists say. And I guess this is coming from a Nature article, so you might want to check out that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Even if they're at equity, which could be the case, but even if they're at equity, the genes and the genomes that they carry are probably 10 or 100-fold more gene dense.
Exactly.
So we tend to have like 1% of our genome coding. 5% of our genome is arguably evolutionary conserved through the mammalian kingdom, but we don't know what the other 95% does. There's a large project called the ENCODE project trying to figure that out. But the microbes, though, are incredibly gene dense, and they replicate extraordinarily quickly. I mean, some of these bugs are replicating every 30 minutes, some are replicating every 2 or 3 hours. So the evolutionary forces that are going on there at that level really bring into question like a lot of these paleo diets. People talk about how, we have to get back to eating what we were eating many decades ago or even a millennium ago, but it's hard to actually believe that when you know your microbiome is what actually manages most of your diet. That's where most of these bugs are. They're inside your GI. They're very small cells, so you can pack a lot more of them in any given space than a human cell, and that's why their numbers can add up so quickly. And people don't recognize, what do you mean I'm half microbes or all microbes? I don't look like it. Well, it's because the cells are very, very tiny next to human cells, and that as a result, you can pack a lot of them per volume. But I'll look at that Scientific American one. If it's pointed to a Nature paper, it's probably got some merit to it. But it still begs the question: we've got more genes on us than our own, and that brings into question a lot of these simplistic, I think, hypotheses of R versus K. Mm-hmm.
Right, and to just say like, oh, it's R versus K, and to put it in a black and white thing like that for selective pressures, I like your example with cannabis, where by having traits that humans find valuable, that ended up being a really successful reproduction strategy for cannabis. That it just shows like all kinds of things can end up leading to gene propagation. And that's just looking at this from a true gene propagation, looking at the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the bacteria and viruses and all of this good stuff. That's not even taking it to the next level, which is then saying, okay, this is actually how political philosophy is occurring. This is how our political philosophy is determined. To go to that's like a whole nother leap beyond that. And even that first leap is really in question. And they talk about, in the book, they call it psychological tendencies. So in the beginning, when I first started reading this book, in the beginning, they weren't talking about genes at all. They were just saying, R versus K, we're gonna talk to you about psychological tendencies that are related to R versus K. This reproductive strategy theory. And I was like, okay, well, I can understand if you're going to make a case about certain psychological tendencies come together, or certain psychological tendencies tend to be more common in an environment where resources are constrained as opposed to where resources are abundant. I'm willing to entertain that a lot more than if you're saying, this is the genes argument, right? So I was like, okay, let's hear what you have to say. Your psychological tendencies, maybe, I'll entertain this. Let's see what happens. But then they did start getting into later on how, and we found the gene that shows you're liberal if you have this gene, or they took it beyond just the psychological tendencies thing. Mm-hmm. And I know like Bill Whittle, who again was a guest on FDR. He was Steph's guest expert for R versus K. And Steph was saying, talking about genes this, genes that. And Bill was like, no, it's not genetic. It's not genetic. It's just a psychological meme that occurs. And that Steph didn't like call him out on that or anything, but he kind of, got quiet while Bill went on to talk about it some more. But
yeah,
is there a psychological memes that and those can change very quickly. Like, when something happens, traumatic, like 9/11, psychological memes can change and spread quickly. I think that's something you could probably find some good evidence for. There are certainly psychological memes that are common through the West, that people tending to fall in this conservative camp versus this liberal camp. I mean, that's pretty clear that a lot of people divide themselves that way. And there are certain characteristics that are shared by, in general, by people who tend to believe on the conservative side towards those who tend to believe on the liberal side. There's some of these things, excuse me, there are some of these things that you can pair together. It's just when you start saying, well, it's your genes that determine this.
Yeah, that's where
you're not seeing the evidence,
It gets very murky. This brings in some Lamarckian epigenetic stuff and whether memories like this can be imprinted into DNA. And There is some evidence for this, but I would say epigenetics is probably the overly flaunted form of selection. It's difficult to put this into terms of selection, which has definitions about it being there being sexual pressures and evolutionary inheritance in DNA. So epigenetics has anchoring in more Lamarckian effects. So let me describe that a little bit. But for the longest time in history, there was Lamarck versus Darwin, and Darwin had this natural selection approach where your genes had to manifest themselves inside of the environment to a selective advantage so that you had more offspring or more fit offspring. And Lamarck tried to push this angle of, well, some of these giraffes could have stretched their neck so they got long enough and they could eat the food, and that would pass down. An acquired trait could get passed down, and that was more or less debunked for many years, maybe a century, until it very recently in like 2000, I think it was around 2008, they started seeing some evidence of RNA in sperm in mice. And RNA, for those not familiar with RNA versus DNA. RNA is like the task manager in your computer, where the hard drive is your DNA. So your DNA is kind of the written code that gets propagated. The RNA or the program is getting run off of it. And when you see RNA, you think environment. You think the environment is influencing the hard drive to write certain programs. But when RNA ends up in sperm and has an effect on mice in propagation inside of a, let's say, fertilization event, then there are some environmental things that can become influential in heritable patterns. And this is what is considered Lamarckian genetics and epigenetics. Now, as much press as epigenetics gets, it is a very, very rare event next to Mendelian genetics and Darwinian genetics. And so we tend to always put that a couple log scales down in likelihood as being really the cause of what's going on, because they're extraordinarily difficult to measure. And the classic cases you hear in Ireland of starvation that occurred many centuries ago, creating obesity today. And those are tenuous links, but they're there. It is not the governing factor. So when you start saying gene wars, you are implying Mendelian, heritable information. When you start talking about psychology, I think you're getting into this world of epigenetics, which is very difficult to measure, and I frankly think you can fit a lot of false hypotheses to, because of the capacity of the human mind to find patterns it wants to see. I mean, if you look at kind of internet security right now, there are these CAPTCHA tags that exist because humans are good at finding patterns like this that computers aren't. Mm-hmm. Those tags exist because of that evolutionary selection we've gone through, and they tend to work very well right now. That is present in everything we look at, and we have to remind ourselves that as scientists and as people looking at data, that we're going to have a tendency to find a pattern that fits what we want to believe. Yeah, and I think that's what's going on here.
And as scientists or people that admire science and want to be scientific, it's important to always try to falsify what you're believing or what you're trying to believe or what you're trying to gather evidence for, to try to see if there's another way to explain this and gather data to refute your hypothesis, right?
Yeah. And that's I'm not seeing that in what he's presented so far.
No.
What I've seen is zero acknowledgement of the countervailing opinions, which arguably I think are more substantiated today.
Yeah, how much research has been done on this process within a human being of changing their belief system, changing their philosophy, and then seeing if there's any epigenetic changes?
All right, so this has been a conundrum for a field. So I work in a field of pediatric neurology where we sequence a lot of children for epilepsy and autism and developmental delay. And the biggest challenge we have is that whenever people have tried to do genome-wide association studies, these are an approach to find regions of the genome that have signature or association with particular traits. And IQ is one that's always brought up.
Yeah.
Right. So and I'm using IQ as a parallel because when you start talking about psychology, it's the only one, that seems to be debated and measured. And we've had a really hard time, despite genome-wide association studies being very good at finding signature for epilepsy and maybe Crohn's disease and a handful of other cardiac events. It has had a really difficult time finding anything related to IQ. And so I think the reason for that is that the brain is incredibly complex, and there are probably 500 to maybe 4,000 genes involved in intelligence. If you even want to measure it on an IQ scale, which I think is a fallacy in and of itself.
Yeah, IQ is how well you've done on the IQ test, and even to look at the research, if there's been any, about a person that does 100 on an IQ test, scores 100, and then follows up and scores a 115 a little bit later. So they've somehow increased their IQ. Has there been any changes that it can be perceived genetically or epigenetically?
I mean, we're both talking over computers right now that when we buy these things, we don't put one number on them.
Exactly.
Right. It's like you look about RAM, you look about CPU, you look about bus speeds, you'd be crazy to put even these simple computers that I don't think are nearly as complicated as the human brain. We don't measure with one scalar number.
And then forevermore, say your low IQ or your average IQ or your high IQ. I mean, it's really categorizing people in a way that essentially pigeonholes them.
I think it fails to understand I've been more of a fan of the multiple intelligence theory, where your brain probably has multiple different CPU sectors, whether it be visual cortex, it's very good at pattern finding, or auditory recognition, or you're very good at logic or computing, and all of these are perhaps different types of neuronal centers in your brain that perform differently based on how it's genetically arranged. There's more neuronal connections in your brain than there are bases in your genome. Okay, so your genome cannot code for this thing one by one. It can code for sort of a seeding event, and then your environment tends to dictate how your brain develops from there. And there's very interesting studies where if you patch somebody's eye when they're developing, they'll focus all of their visual cortex on the other eye. There's a lot of neuroplasticity that goes into this. So it's for me, when I hear of these psychological memes and can I get right into the DNA, I mean, if it's there, it's going to be extraordinarily remote and probably ephemeral, that I'd be surprised if it actually passes its way down generation to generation in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
There's probably some studies that try and point to that, but I'm somewhat skeptical that it is a selective pressure that can be applied in sort of a gene wars concept.
So, going back to the multiple intelligences that you had mentioned, you subscribe to that theory. So would somebody that's in the IQ camp, would they say, well, if you have a higher IQ, you're going to do better on in general on probably all of the areas of multiple intelligence? Is that the argument that would be made, and has that been debunked? If that makes sense.
It's possible. I mean, my general sense is that when you look at these association studies that try and pinpoint one gene or a few areas of the genome that correlate with IQ, we can't find it. And to me, that's a sign that the metric, not necessarily that there isn't some kind of genetic component to intelligence, is there, but that the metric of using IQ as a mechanism to describing human intelligence is failing. If you can't actually find a genetic signature to it, then maybe it's the actual test that's wrong, not the actual genetics. And that's my general sense on that, is because I know of multiple people that their intelligence has changed over their lifetime, for whether it's been hard work or whether it's been late bloomers. I also know there are people that are extraordinarily intelligent in different things. I mean, you can see some of this in even in the autism space. When you start looking at diseases where neurology has been disrupted, like in epilepsy and autism and some of these developmental delays, some of these children, like Asperger's, are incredibly intelligent in certain places. Some of them have complete photographic memory. And does that help in an IQ test or doesn't? I don't know. Probably helps. And there are others that are can be proteges in music and perhaps can't complete a sentence. So I think it's pigeonholing the human mind to say that there's one number that describes all of intelligence when we refuse to even buy a computer based on that.
Yeah.
On top of that, that it seems like, at best, a really primitive way to try to measure intelligence in a human, dependent on an IQ score. I mean, let's just, for the sake of argument, say that does accurately measure some form of intelligence. What Steph is using with these numbers is to then build an argument on top of that, saying, hey, that means that, since immigrants, they have a lower intelligence, they've been shown in these studies that have been done that they have a lower IQs than the average current U.S. citizen. that, we're dumbing down the gene pool, where, these people should not be let in. We should be able to use force to keep them out. I'm like, okay, so basically what you're telling me is because someone has less intelligence, they don't have the right to move. I mean, that's really what the argument is they're making. And I'm like, okay,
it's a central planner argument.
Yeah,
it's a central planner argument.
It is totally, and it's collectivizing every child that has aspirations and dreams to have a better life in a place that is relatively more free or has more economic freedom.
And every immigrant.
Well, I mean, it fails on a couple fronts because, first of all, yeah, like you said, Wes, you're collectivizing. Surely there are people of high and low intelligence, and it's not fair to say, well, because you're from this collective that on the whole does lower in this one category, you as the individual, even though you're just fine in that area, we're going to discriminate against you and take away your freedoms. So that fails.
Yeah, statistics has determined the course of political policy, apparently.
Right, that fails. But then even beyond that, and where does race? I mean, you don't have the right to move because you're not as intelligent. I mean, that's really what the argument comes down to. And I'm like, that's try to make that. I mean, Steph is a self-proclaimed moral philosopher. Make the moral argument that, from a philosophical standpoint, that if you're less intelligent, you don't have the right to move. Make that argument, Steph. I mean, he always says, universalize these arguments that are made, and then you'll see that's where like the contradictions in society fall away. So universalize printing money. If it's okay for the Fed to print money, then it should be okay for me to do it. But when I do it, it's called counterfeiting. If I take somebody and throw them in a cage, it's kidnapping. Where if the police officer does it, they're just doing their job. If you universalize it, you see where the evil is, right? I mean, just universalize that. So, I mean, if someone's less has a lower intelligence, you can throw them. You're then allowed to not. You're not allowed to move.
Of subjective value theory here, right? This is Carl Menger classic. And that let's assume, give him credit that IQ means something, and then there's a spectrum and a bell curve. If you believe all that, right? Is it not the case that the way the economy grows, and according to subjective value theory, that people find win-win relationships between parties, and there could be low and high IQ people making exchanges, and what you're suggesting is that you should rip all the low IQ people out and then have only high IQ run the economy. That implies precisely every single microcosm of the economy and how it's going to interact, that you can predict that having only one subselection of the IQ field is going to create the best economy. That's hubris.
It totally is, and Chris and I have talked about my experiences interfacing with people in Mensa, a couple standard deviations above the mean, which is at least in the top 5% or 1% of the population in terms of their testing on intelligence tests. It, across the board, they're mostly liberal. So I guess they'd be in the R group, according to this fallacious theory of R versus K. How do you explain that one? Like these really intelligent people buying into the liberal arguments, and of course really intelligent people buying into the conservative arguments. What we want to do is adopt a belief system that is win-win with other human beings, which is based on respect and voluntary interaction, not based on a foundation of coercion in our society. And it seems like there's no correlation between IQ and that freedom-based philosophy. And so to make these convoluted arguments that have no evidence to them on a very scientific genetic level just is so off the rails. It's hard to even fathom how this is possible in a human being that's done a lot of shows in the past, thousands of them, talking about the basic principles that are necessary for people to integrate. And people have integrated from all kinds of different ideologies, R versus K, whatever. They've come to the freedom philosophy based on sound principles, not based on statistics about IQ and evidence and Freedom Club this and all this other nonsense.
And the flip side of his argument sounds to be immigration-based, what does that mean? How does he deem an immigrant to be of one race or genetic category?
Statistics show that one of the latest shows I heard, they posted on YouTube what's wrong with libertarians about immigration, or why libertarians have immigration wrong in some respects. But he was basically saying that immigrants, on average, 50% indulge in the welfare status stuff, versus 30% of Americans. But then my response to that is, well, who set up the welfare state to begin with? It's these memes of altruism, of self-sacrifice, of trying to take care of others at other people's expense. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. And, you know, Chris, the old Steph would have said this, right? He did in those shows.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, the new Steph, what he says when you disagree with him, he's like, if you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with science. If you disagree with me, you disagree with math.
Because, of course, he has a background in such a thing. Right. Yeah, I don't know where to go with that.
Well, he's supposedly interviewing experts. This is his contention.
It goes down an ugly direction, and it's gone this direction before, where people try to pin immigrants or race with IQ, and all of that bell curve stuff has been thoroughly debunked. And it doesn't take much more than a high school level biology course to understand that the genetics of skin color have nothing. They're very discrete. There's like 6 or 8 SNPs in the genome that describe this, and to then propose that those 6 or 8 are then in linkage to equilibrium. In other words, they're very close to all the genes that involve intelligence, which we can't find, and we think there's 4,000 of them. It's a mathematics problem. You cannot make that correlation. And they've tried over and over again to say that race and IQ matter. And a couple other libertarians have gone down this rabbit hole, not having a genetics background. And if you get involved in anyone who knows genetics, they'll tell you that that's a preposterous claim. We know precisely the genetics that dictate skin color. And if we could find IQ, we'd look right next to those if what your theory says is true. And when we do, we don't find any correlation with IQ. So the genetics of intelligence are extraordinarily complicated, and the genetics of skin color are quite defined, and we understand them. And to claim they're associated is another confirmation bias that people are looking for.
Yeah. There's an excerpt by an anonymous conservative in that book that he wrote, which again is titled "The Evolutionary Psychology Behind Politics: How Conservatism and Liberalism Evolved Within Humans." So I just keyword searched the word libertarian in there to try to find out what he's talking about with that regard, with that ideology. And he said it would not be surprising if many libertarians today would relish moving to more rural areas with lower population densities, especially if that entailed fewer interactions with peers, such as governmental restrictions placed on their behavior by neighbors and countrymen. That is how, in a state of nature, an imbued reproductive strategy can craft an individual's life path and their strategy to survive and pass on their genes. Of course, due to the nature of the low population densities they were designed for, such a libertarian strategy would be a minority strategy within our species numerically. This might make sense of the fact that while libertarianism always seems a perfect compromise in a world of left and right, it can never garner enough support to be a realistic option. R and K are just too deeply embedded within the nature of most citizens within our populations for that battle to ever be abandoned. Whether libertarianism is a practical strategy today or merely a vestigial psychology designed for environments we long ago conquered is unknown. But much like conservatism and liberalism, it is a psychology that would prove adaptive to certain environments in our past. Returning to our narrative, the vast majority of policy positions of the two main political ideologies align closely with the psychological tendencies of the R-selected and K-selected Darwinian reproductive strategies.
Darwinian?
Yeah, Darwinian. It should be noted that this theory is the only theory extant which would explain the nature of the unusual aggregation of specific moral and governmental policy positions inherent to the two main modern political ideologies. As a result, it is difficult to not view modern political ideology as merely an intellectual manifestation of the primitive urges which guide organisms to pursue either an R or K selected reproductive strategy in nature. As we continue and examine how resource availability affects societal perceptions of the ideologies, this theory's apparent veracity will only grow.
Wow. Okay, so we'll throw down just one exception right here out of the gate is we've spoken about cannabis. Mm-hmm. Here's a plant that when you stress it arguably you would say this is not a K-selected species, it's R, because when it fertilizes, it makes thousands of seeds and it sends them as far as it can, and it's clearly going for the propagative path of basically making as many offspring as possible. You stress this plant, it turns into hermaphrodite and self-fertilizes asexually and makes just as many seeds. Did it get stressed into a K environment, or is it still R? It's still R. And I think there's just many case after case in fruit flies and everything else that show this is not Darwinian. This is pseudoscience that he's driving at. And I find it quite fascinating because I have heard one or two of his podcasts where he's been somewhat. I'd say the right word is condescending. It probably describes a lot of his podcasts, but his condescending tone usually comes at folks attempting to be experts in fields they're not. And here he is as a philosopher with some software background, running a podcast talking about genetics when he seems to have not even read the countervailing opinions in R versus K. And they're like in Wikipedia. You don't need to go far to find this stuff.
Yeah, it has surface plausibility to cater to people's biases, it seems. And, he's really addressing the conservative Christian crowd to get more listeners, more viewers, more donators at the expense of the principles. I mean, in this last, one of the conversation shows he had, really disturbing stuff in regards to what they were talking about. It's episode 3170, for those who want to listen to it. But they've actually allowed some people with dissenting opinions and people that are picking up on this real change in his perspective over the last couple of years and trying to point this out, but he just took over the stage and he goes on this diatribe against all the libertarians who are against the peaceful parenting perspective that he's offered in the past. And he made a case that the initiation of force is actually okay in today's society because we live in a society of statism. So therefore, there is no morality anymore, and you don't have any choices. So you just have to pick the lesser of two evils. So advocating the initiation of force by border enforcement, this imaginary line that statists have dreamt of, to indicate this is our place, the in-group, versus the out-group, and we can control whether some people from the out-group can come in for the whole collective. I mean, that is preferable than having people freely come into America to participate in this economy because they're going to be, by and large, welfare status, and they're going to initiate force against us through the tax system of welfare statism, as if they're the ones that cooked up that whole program to begin with, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of the signs were there even years ago. If you look at some of the casts, I appreciated early on some of his casts, but some of them where he interviewed people who appeared to be psychologically hurt, he would jackal them. He would just he'd almost tear them apart publicly on radio. And to me, I always looked at that saying, "Wow, that's something's going on in him that isn't resolved, that he needs to do this to others." And I think that's coming through. He tried to do this to Michael Dean once on one of his radio shows, and Michael didn't take any piece of it. But I've heard a few others, and it really turned me off because here he is trying to pretend to help people by slaying their psychological issues out on public radio. And it to me, it smelled of something's not right here, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it seems to be all unfolding right now.
Yeah, to have this ideology and then try to couch it in evidence and statistics and science, it's just, again, catering to all the biases out there that are inclined towards the fascism that we see in America that's supportive of the Trump agenda.
Yeah, if you want to convince somebody of something, put a number on it, right?
Yeah, I guess so. It lends some credence to it, I guess, surface plausibility, even though it's pseudoscience.
Right. Yeah, and he still claims to be a libertarian, but the message he's giving is definitely one of, more of a conservative, of a Republican or a neocon. He's putting out there basically the talking points of the neocons these days, and I don't know if he still claims to be a libertarian, because if he didn't, it would really contradict all of the previous shows he's had out there in his books or not. But, even in this anonymous conservative book, in there, they're making the claim that libertarians are outside of the R versus K equation, that there's something else. They're not R or K. There's some separate thing. And it's interesting to me that Steph is promoting this R versus K, this theory, or something even less than a theory. He's promoting this and clearly siding with the K's, siding with the conservatives, when that theory says, well, K's aren't libertarians. Where meanwhile, he's still saying he's a libertarian. So it's like there's contradictions all over the place here. Mm-hmm. Libertarians are outside of the R versus K paradigm, but libertarians are about freedom. Isn't that what he's all been about? I mean, even if you look in the book, they talk about how the R strategy people are for sexual freedoms. So there's a big thing in there about the R's and in the 60s when there was kind of the free love thing going on, and in comparing that to R strategy propagating and the like. But libertarians are all about freedom. Libertarians, and I mean, there is that libertine movement where they're very overtly about like sexual freedoms and the like. And of course, whether that's psychologically healthy or not, the libertine movement is one thing. But Steph has been very openly critical about that sort of thing, about sexual freedoms and the libertine movement. And he's not a libertarian anymore. He's clearly not.
No, I would agree. And what's kind of interesting is this doesn't seem to float with some numbers here, right? So the Foundation for Economic Education is putting out great stuff lately on, and I don't even think it's their own studies. They're just highlighting other studies, which is that more people are being risen out of poverty ever before, right? Mm-hmm. Probably in the last 50 years, there's been more people risen out of poverty than all of human history, something along those lines. And so if that's the case, then the human population is no longer carrying capacity limited. We should all be liberals and running around replicating like jackrabbits.
Exactly. Yeah, there's this argument that in a land of abundance, right, it's going to cause the R's to take over sort of thing, right? And then all of a sudden we die off, they die off.
And that doesn't happen, actually. If you look at nations and countries that go through economic expansion and move from third world to first world, they tend to have less offspring.
Yeah.
It's a number. I don't know if it's tied to...
As women become more educated, they tend to have less offspring, fewer.
Yeah, there's maybe it's birth control. Maybe it's, who knows what it is. There could be a lot of factors there, but... this rising more people out of poverty tends to decrease the birth rate, which goes against his theory that when there's infinite resources, everyone replicates like jackrabbits.
Yeah. It is interesting why they're not making just the cultural arguments, that the Christian right typically offers, why there's this desire to link it to genetics,
I think
because then you're justified. It's a gene war, so you're justified in using violence to keep the brown-skinned people from coming in.
Yes.
So it's a way to justify your cultural beliefs, but the Christian right doesn't really need that. They don't rely on that.
If they're a different species, and they're and you're at war with them, you are justified using violence to keep those brown-skinned people out. So it's about Hispanics migrating into the United States, and it's also about Muslims. He's very into the whole anti-Muslim thing right now as well, mm-hmm. which tend to be of a different skin color, even though classifying Muslim as a race is a challenging thing to do.
And forgetting the fact that they developed algebra and a variety of other things that he's trying to rest his logic on.
Mm-hmm. He quoted some statistic he came up with saying that 50% of the Muslim population, I think in America, are in favor of Sharia. They would prefer Islamic law over U.S. law. But, that's neither here nor there because law itself is...
a religion.
Yeah. This illegitimate way for people to have power over others. So that needs to be really addressed. That's getting into philosophy. And yet there is this desire to go to the so-called science and the genes to somehow justify the philosophy. What do you think that is, Kevin?
I think what that is modern America has a new religion. If it's not the state, it's scientists that are associated with the state. Mm. And so if you can anchor anything in a white lab coat, you can get the herds to follow you. And it's a very dangerous proposition because this has been used time and time before in the past to try and coax masses of people to do stupid things. So I think he's trying to pin this gene war thing and give it some legitimacy in modern day reverence of the genomics era. And it's actually a fabricated story that's pushing his own political beliefs. So yeah, that's my guess is that if you can anchor it, just as you guys were mentioning, in some type of gene thing, then you can start to draw races and you can say it's for the betterment of mankind to propagate certain genes because we're going to centrally plan the gene pool because we know what's best.
Right. And if that doesn't sound like Nazi propaganda,
it is, yeah. Straight chapter right out of that book.
Yeah, in that same conversation, episode 3170, he said, talking about how multiculturalism doesn't work, it's really detrimental and destructive to society. And he said, quote, "Only fools and dogmatists ignore that fact."
Wow.
So
yeah, there goes Carl Maker.
He's basically, couching it in statistics. Once again, looking at these studies that show when certain races of people commingle, there's all these detrimental effects. But I would really like to look at the nature of that research and what they did, what their assumptions were. And of course, they're missing the larger picture of how government has affected people's economic life, let alone cultural lives.
So to take the inverse of his logic there, which is, okay, let's all inbreed ourselves with ourselves over and over again. Where does that go? All right, there is this thing known as hybrid vigor in genomics, where when you cross diverse genetics together, you get a host of new gene traits that can be adaptive to new environments and do different things. And perhaps the worst thing you can ever do is back cross yourself or inbreed yourself into one homozygous line such that you're then susceptible to many, many diseases.
Yeah.
So he's going down a road of genetic xenophobia, which we know is genetically actually unstable.
But yeah, like you said, your theory that he's using science as a religion as a way to get people to their eyes to glaze over and just nod their head and agree with his political philosophy. I mean, I think I pretty much heard him say, like, I think this is a direct quote. Like, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science. If it's not a direct quote, it's a really close paraphrase.
Yeah, he said the gist of that a few times.
And it's one of those things where, it reminds me, what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the arguments that the people that are for global warming make. They're like, right. Well, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science. Where meanwhile,
95%, whatever, yeah.
Consensus, right?
Yeah, if you go back and you actually, look at the studies, look at the source material and question some of the premises and the like. I mean, like Wes was saying, it's like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody reference a study, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty interesting. Like, if that's really true, I really need to make some changes, And then I'll Google the study and I'll actually read the study, and I'm like, what? This isn't prove that. They totally said this study proved, ABC. It doesn't even remotely close come to that. It's it's at best it's loosely related,
Very few people do what you just did. Well, I'm glad you did, because I've read a few of those as well. One of the most cited Nature papers on this is the Volsta chi-scores. And if you dig into that, figure 5 in that paper shows that 40,000 or 35,000 years ago, we had 11 degrees C change in 40 years. 40 years, 11 degrees C, all right? There weren't any cars then, okay? So that's never mentioned. It's just mentioned the sky's falling, we need carbon credits and all of this business. But people will just replicate those memes throughout the internet, not actually digging in to see, wait a minute, there's two really interesting pieces of information in this paper, and only one of them is being surfaced. So yeah, that's an area, a whole other field that unfortunately is a very difficult field to get your head around, because the vast majority of global warming science is funded through governments. There's very few private enterprises doing it for I don't know what reason. But it's only funded through politicians, and so I'm very skeptical of the data that comes out of that, because I've been involved in getting grants from government, and there's a self-selection bias. If you apply for a grant that's looking to pursue something that they don't care about, you don't get funded. And so you can't really apply for a grant suggesting I want to try and prove that global warming is wrong and expect to get funding. You won't. So there's definitely, I think the whole world agrees on efficiency, right? We shouldn't be inefficient. But this concept that we should let politicians suddenly bring in a carbon tax, which is what we exhale and what plants inhale, is insane. You'll hear this 95% consensus thing thrown around under the banner of science, and it's just not true. There's plenty of scientists that think that they don't know, and that's where I am. It's a very complicated equation. I don't know what the answer is, but the last thing I'm going to do is watch humans die because you believe something that you can't measure yet.
Yeah,
and that seems to be where the whole anthropomorphic global warming thing is that we are somehow outside of nature, and we need to remove ourselves from it somehow. And yet every other organism here is, if ants build ant mines and other things, there's all types of microbes in the ocean that have a bigger impact on CO2 concentration than we do. And yet they're allowed to do it, but we're not. And so there's a very weird, I think, religion of humans being outside of nature that infests that entire field of thought. And it often flies under the banner of, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever problems that humanity has created through technological innovation and so forth, we can solve with technological innovation, but it can never be solved with coercion and initiation of force, especially when it's collectivized in the system called government, you know?
Yeah. I think I saw something yesterday at someone at MIT figured out how to make the incandescent bulb more efficient than LEDs. It's like, there you go. We regulated those things out of existence, and now they're back. And LEDs are pretty expensive, and incandescents are quite affordable. So
yeah, it boils down to individuals coming up with solutions to hard problems, and that can only be done when there's freedom. You know, by and large, can only be done when there's freedom. I mean, we're not seeing all of the unseen costs that government has wreaked upon our society and diminished our capacity to live and flourish and really enjoy our lives. So, I mean, that's the philosophical discussion that seems to have been dropped in favor of this sort of genetic statistics, you know, pseudoscientific perspective to lend support to a really biased collectivism and basically racism that's going on over there. And of course, they're couching that in the IQ scores. They don't lie, right? On average, the whites are higher than blacks and Asians are higher than whites. But what does that actually mean in terms of individuals? You know, that's what really matters. As Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority in the world is the individual. And the distinctive quality in human beings, regardless of what their genes are, is the fact that they can reason and they have the capacity to choose. They have volition. Volitional capacity comes with reasoning capacity. We're able to integrate concepts, to formulate concepts, to deal with ideas in a way that other animals simply cannot. Like we have mental constructs that we can use to our advantage or to our disadvantage. So it's important to get those things clear, which is the whole realm of philosophy and psychology too, because we need to look at the emotions involved in all this stuff. And I think underlying a lot of this message that you're getting from Free Domain Radio, that everyone's, you know, being subjected to in the culture through Trump and so forth, is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear based on needs for security and safety, you know, and that's not really being put in focus and dealt with in an empathetic way, you know, for themselves, because it's easier somehow to get in this protection mode and in-group, out-group, and moralistic judgment, you know?
Yeah, and it's certainly one that has it's an infection, without a doubt, this fear thing, because they skew the numbers so dramatically one direction by highlighting everything that is possibly wrong in the world and failing to cover all the things that are getting incredibly better. And when you look at human interactions in general, there's less violence, more people are running out of poverty. There's just nothing but optimism if you actually look at the data. But what do you see magnified in the political sphere is nothing but fear. How do we motivate people?
Yeah, just total fear-mongering and propaganda.
Yeah, and that evokes a very visceral response that we need one leader for us to all, where's this one leader going and what are they talking about? Are we all going the same direction? That'd be kind of insane. So it's I think he's lost sense of this subjective value theory that runs throughout all of Austrian economics, which is that there are. And I actually came into this kind of liberty concept through genomics because I've got thrown aghast by how much variation there is between all of us. I mean, there's 4 million variants between every single individual, and then when you go into these microbiomes and all the other environmental variables what we're into, that we're all running around in very different genetic shoes. And for us to assume that we all know where all of that should go is hubris. And what has to happen is they all have to randomly interact and find the best partnerships, and that's how wealth grows.
Yes.
The pie is actually getting bigger every day. It's not getting smaller. It's not the rich against the poor because we're all competing for one set pie. If the population is growing and more people are moving out of poverty, that means the pie is growing.
Exactly. Comparative advantage, right?
Yeah, we're finding voluntary interactions that maximize each other's wealth by allowing that free trade. And that same thing is happening genetically, where we're all interbreeding with different people in different ways, maximizing the genetic utility. For somebody to come up and say that, I believe it needs to go this direction, all in favor of race and IQ, that person is a thief, and you got to run away.
Yeah.
All right. Well, We've been talking for quite some time now. We should probably go ahead and wrap it up.
I have a couple other closing whoppers if you want, Chris, just a couple minutes worth.
You got closing whoppers? Is that what you said?
Yeah, in that same conversation stuff, because just to follow up on what Kevin just talked about in terms of the Austrian school of looking at things and people's choices and the ability to actually maximize their potential among others and interacting in a marketplace. Steph said, statistically, immigrants are taking away jobs and driving down wages. So again, he's relying on the so-called evidence for this, but there's a lot of other counteracting evidence, evidence in contradiction to what he just said there, and it's based on a whole bunch of economic fallacies. So that's a meme he's been promoting. And then he also said, I turn to the less rapey gun. So in other words, the lesser of the two evils in terms of the initiation of force, and, quote, there is no moral answer to this. And then he also said the immigrants supposedly are only here for social benefits, in other words, the welfare state. And
Unbelievable.
He walked people through this example of health insurance costing $20,000 a year, right? So it's cost prohibitive for people from third world countries to come here because they're not going to be able to afford health care, so they're going to be going to the government welfare system, right? And so he said, and I quote, when you have a free society, or a relatively free society, things are kind of expensive because there's high quality.
Jesus.
Now, if that isn't an economic contradiction...
Oh, my God. Well, it contradicts what he's talked before about friendly societies and how cheap healthcare is in a free society, and gave the example of the friendly societies like the like the Eagles Club and the Raritan, and I forget, you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And he's done several shows. He's mentioned it probably in 10 or 20 different shows. Quality as an example of how free market healthcare is really, really cheap and really, really good. It's high quality and it's low cost.
Free markets create abundance and cheaper products and services and higher quality products and services. So yeah, and he ended, the last note I took about this was, quote, immigration is a government program and it's currently tearing America apart. So the focus is no longer on government itself as the huge program that's destroying people's lives, regardless of where they're from or what their ethnicity is or what their genetics are about. It's this in-group, out-group stuff.
Which I will end on saying, whenever we have tried to measure race genetically, it all falls apart. So all of these studies, and Wes, you nailed it in saying it's about the individual. That's the real answer. But the people who don't get that, I try to appease by saying, look, if all of these studies that measure race and IQ measured race with the human eyeball, they measured your skin color, which is an enormous genetic fallacy. There's many people walking around this globe with white skin that have African ancestry. Yeah. And so I'll give you guys some links for show notes and everything. If you want to read papers about this, it's actually advised in a lot of genetic studies to omit anything that pertains to skin color because it's so damn erroneous to the genetics that it destroys clinical trials. And so there's we don't go down that road at all. And it's not because it's a third rail; it's because it has created so many clinical trials to assume that skin color is meaningful genetically.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah. Well, race is so much like a cultural thing where, like in the United States, if you have one grandparent who is black and three that are white, you're a black person. You're not a white person, or you're not 3/4 white or mixed. You just say you're black. It's a cultural definition. It's not anything based in genetics.
Yeah. I think this comes down to politics lives by xenophobia. It has to promote fear to protect you from somebody else. And the actual underlying circulatory system of the entire economy is the lack of xenophobia. It's that you can trade with anyone in the world and find win-win relationships because of differences in perhaps culture, race, and preferences. And the politicians can't say that.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing, just look at one of the most well-known Americans out there, Barack Obama. He's half black, half white, at least by the cultural definitions, as a black father and a white mother.
Well, let's ask Stefan about the Trump birth certificate thing and see what he knows about it.
Yeah, right? But I mean, have you ever heard somebody say Barack Obama's white? I've never heard him be called white, but he's just as white as he is black. I hear we have the first black president. America's got its first black president. How about that? Right, I've heard that 1,000 times. but he's just as white as he is black. And it's like, you never hear Barack Obama's, but it's because it's a cultural definition. If you have any bit of black in there, so it's really a strange thing if you sit back and think about it.
Yeah, it is. Melanin content in the skin. Big deal.
Right.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, I really appreciate your insights, Kevin.
Yeah. So do you want to give a closing message to the listeners? Is there anything you're promoting or that you'd like to share?
It's a little bit related to this. Maybe a bit to the size of this, but we're so I work at Medicinal Genomics and Cortigen. We do a lot of sequencing of patients' genomes to try to personalize their medicine, because we don't believe in this one-size-fits-all medicine system that has been politically inscribed. And we also do a lot of work in cannabis genetics, and we have a conference in April known as CanMed that's being held at Harvard Med School, and Raphael Mechoulam and a variety of other big names in the cannabis field are coming to speak at it to describe how do we personalize cannabinoids to people's individual disease states. And the reason we're passionate about this is we see cannabinoids becoming the over-the-counter solution to the healthcare crisis. It's no mystery to anybody that they're becoming over-the-counter through dispensaries and legalization, and that can radically change the face of personalized medicine if we can connect the right cannabinoids to the right patients, because there's hundreds of them, and the media always likes to focus on the one that makes people happy, because that's bad. And so we're taking a medicine approach to this. It's April 10th and 11th in Boston. If those who want to join, check out the Medicinal Genomics website. There's a banner there about the presentations to be had. You can submit abstracts if you want to speak, and it should be a really, really good time.
And will Big Pharma be protesting outside?
Well, no, we're open to all of that. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some present. I mean, I have my concerns over the FDA model, but at times it works. There's certainly a lot of investors that want to go that route because there's certain levels of protection. But either way, we don't pick sides.
Gotcha.
All right, Wes, why don't you tell the listeners if they want to get some more Wes Bertrand in their life, what do they need to do?
CompleteLiberty.com. You'll find the podcast there and the couple books I've written on the subject. And happinesscounseling.com. I've got a great resource page there.
Awesome. All right. And I will put links to all of this in the show notes. And all right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks.
Thank you as well. Peace.
Cheers.
Where can my baby be? Lord took her away from me. She's gone to heaven, so I got to be good, so I can see my baby before I leave this world. When I woke up, the rain was pouring down. There were people standing all around. Something warm flowing from my eye. Somehow I found my baby that night. Lifted her head, she looked at me and said, hold me, darling, for a little while. Held her close, we kissed our last kiss. Found the love, knew I would miss. Now she's gone, and even though I hold her tight, lost my love, my life that night. Where can my baby be? Lord took her away from me. She's gone to heaven, so I got to be good, so I can see my baby before I leave this world. Oh,